Picture this: an absolute king, master of lives and lands, being forced to his knees before his own barons. In 1215, England witnessed a historic coup, a document that dared to limit royal power and plant the seeds of modern democracy. This is the power of the Magna Carta, but let me paint you the full picture of just how dramatic this moment really was. We're talking about a time when kings claimed to rule by divine right, when a monarch's word was literally law, and when challenging the crown meant certain death. Yet here we have a group of rebellious nobles cornering their own king in a muddy field, demanding he sign away chunks of his absolute authority. It's like forcing a dictator to write his own resignation letter. The 13th century found England teetering on the edge of chaos. King John, infamously known as John Lackland because he lost most of his French territories, had become the most hated ruler in English history. This man didn't just raise taxes, he invented new ones. He didn't just lose battles, he lost entire kingdoms. His military failures were so spectacular that his own barons started calling him soft sword behind his back. Here's a fascinating detail most people don't know. John actually tried to avoid this confrontation by taking a crusader's vow, hoping the church's protection would shield him from his rebellious nobles. But his barons weren't buying it. They'd watched him bleed England dry to fund his disastrous wars in France, and they'd had enough. The result? A forced agreement, sealed in a field at Runnymede on a June day that would echo through 8 centuries of history, the Magna Carta. But here's what will blow your mind. What does this 800-year-old text have to do with your rights today? Well, imagine if I told you that every time you demand a fair trial, every time you expect due process, every time you believe that even the most powerful person in your country can't be above the law, you're invoking principles that trace back to that muddy field in 1215. The Magna Carta didn't just limit one king's power, it established the revolutionary idea that power itself must have limits. And here's the kicker: John signed this document fully intending to break every promise in it. Within weeks, he was plotting to tear it up, and he very nearly succeeded. The fact that we're talking about it today is nothing short of miraculous. If you love history and want to uncover how a single piece of parchment changed the world forever, hit that like button, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles, and don't miss a single episode of these incredible historical journeys. John Lackland was definitely not what you'd call a man of the people. After losing massive territories in France and cranking up taxes to crushing levels, the barons finally said, enough. In 1215, they took up arms and demanded a document that would protect their privileges. But without realizing it, they created something much bigger. Let me tell you just how spectacularly John had messed things up. This guy inherited one of the largest empires in medieval Europe, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But by 1215, he'd managed to lose almost everything north of the Loire River in France. We're talking about losing roughly half of the Angevin Empire in just 15 years. His brother Richard the Lionheart must have been spinning in his grave. But here's where it gets really interesting. John wasn't just a military failure, he was a financial disaster too. To fund his hopeless attempts to win back his French territories, he squeezed England like a lemon. He demanded money from everyone: the church, the nobles, the merchants, even widows who wanted to remarry. And get this, he literally held people's children hostage until their parents paid up. One baron had to give John his son as a guarantee for a debt. And when he couldn't pay, John reportedly had the boy starved to death. That's the kind of king we're dealing with here. The final straw came when John lost the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. This wasn't just any defeat. It was a catastrophic loss that ended his dreams of reconquering his French lands forever. The barons looked at their empty coffers, their dead sons, and their humiliated kingdom, and they'd finally had enough. So picture this scene. Some of the most powerful men in England, guys who could trace their bloodlines back to the Norman conquest, meeting in secret and plotting against their own king. They called themselves the Army of God and Holy Church, which sounds pretty dramatic, but really, they were just fed-up nobles who wanted their money back and their king under control. What's fascinating is that these barons didn't originally want to create a constitution or establish rights for all people. They were essentially medieval businessmen trying to protect their investments. They wanted John to stop bleeding them dry and follow some basic rules. But in demanding that even the king must obey the law, they accidentally stumbled onto one of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Only 4 original copies of the 1215 Magna Carta survive today. These aren't just old documents, they're priceless artifacts of human freedom. One of them was actually sold at auction in 2007 for $21 million. Imagine paying that much for what's essentially an 800-year-old legal complaint. But that's the power of this document. It's not just parchment. It's the physical embodiment of the idea that power has limits. Now here's where things get really revolutionary. The Magna Carta established that not even the king was above the law. Just think about how radical that idea was in 1215. For centuries, people had believed that kings ruled by divine right, that they were God's representatives on earth. But this document essentially said, "Sorry, Your Majesty, you've got to follow the rules too." The most famous part is Article 39, which guaranteed that no free man could be imprisoned without a proper trial. This was the embryo of what we now call due process, the idea that you can't just throw someone in jail because you feel like it. You need evidence, you need a fair hearing, you need to follow proper procedures. It sounds obvious to us today, but back then, this was earth-shattering. But here's the catch that most people don't realize, and this is where the story gets really interesting. When the Magna Carta talked about free men, they weren't talking about everybody. In fact, these free men made up only about 10% of England's population. The other 90%? Well, they were serfs, and serfs were essentially property. They belonged to the land, and whoever owned the land owned them. Let me paint you a picture of medieval England. Imagine a society where most people couldn't leave their village without permission, couldn't marry without their lord's approval, and had to work their master's fields for free several days a week. These weren't citizens with rights. They were human property, passed down from father to son along with the livestock and farming tools. So when the barons demanded protection from King John's tyranny, they were really only looking out for themselves and their wealthy friends. The local blacksmith, the village carpenter, the farmers working the fields, none of them were covered by these magnificent new rights. It's like having a constitution that only applies to millionaires. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Even though the Magna Carta was written by the elite for the elite, it contained an idea so powerful that it couldn't be contained. The principle that law should limit power, that authority should have boundaries, that even the mightiest ruler must answer to something higher than his own will. This concept would eventually grow far beyond what those medieval barons ever imagined. There's another crucial principle hidden in the Magna Carta that people often miss: the idea of proportional punishment. The document stated that fines should match the severity of the offense. You couldn't bankrupt someone for a minor crime. Again, this only applied to free men, but the principle was there waiting to be expanded. And here's a detail that shows just how practical these barons were. They didn't just write down these rights and hope for the best. They created a committee of 25 barons whose job was to make sure the king actually followed the rules. If John broke his promises, they had the right to rebel against him legally. They basically wrote a revolution clause into the Constitution. It was like saying, "We trust you, John, but we're also going to appoint 25 guys to watch you like hawks." Picture this. It's June 15th, 1215. King John has just put his royal seal on the Magna Carta at Runnymede. The barons are celebrating, thinking they've finally tamed their tyrannical king. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. John had absolutely no intention of keeping his word. Within weeks of signing the charter, John was already plotting his revenge. You see, medieval kings weren't exactly known for their democratic spirit, and John was particularly vindictive. He looked at that document not as a sacred agreement, but as a humiliating defeat that needed to be undone at any cost. And John had a powerful ally in his corner, Pope Innocent III. Now you might wonder why the Pope would get involved in English politics, but remember, John had made England a papal fief just 2 years earlier. This meant the Pope was technically John's overlord, and he was furious that anyone would dare limit the power of his vassal king. In August of 1215, just 10 weeks after the Magna Carta was signed, Pope Innocent declared the charter null and void. Can you imagine the barons' shock? Their hard-won victory was being swept away by papal decree. The Pope called the Magna Carta shameful and demeaning, and threatened to excommunicate anyone who tried to enforce it. But the barons weren't about to give up without a fight. They had tasted freedom from royal tyranny, and they weren't going back. What followed was one of the bloodiest civil wars in English medieval history, the First Barons' War. John, emboldened by papal support, hired foreign mercenaries, and began a brutal campaign against the rebellious nobles. He burned their castles, seized their lands, and showed no mercy. The barons responded by doing something unprecedented. They invited Prince Louis of France, the future King Louis VIII, to invade England and claim the throne. Think about that for a moment. These English nobles were so desperate to escape John's tyranny that they were willing to hand their country over to the French. Louis landed in England in May 1216 with a substantial army, and suddenly John found himself fighting on multiple fronts. The war was devastating. Castles were besieged, towns were burned, and the common people suffered terribly. John's mercenaries, mostly from continental Europe, showed particular brutality toward English civilians. It seemed like the Magna Carta's ideals of justice and law were dying in the flames of civil war. But then, in a twist worthy of a Hollywood screenplay, fate intervened. In October 1216, King John died suddenly at Newark Castle. Some say it was dysentery, others whisper about poison, but one thing was certain: his death changed everything. John's heir was his 9-year-old son, Henry III. Now, you can't run a kingdom in the middle of a civil war with a child king, so a regency council was formed, led by the elderly but respected William Marshal. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Marshal made a brilliant political move. Instead of continuing John's aggressive policies, he decided to reissue the Magna Carta. But this wasn't just a political stunt. Marshal understood that the charter represented something the people desperately wanted: protection from royal abuse. By embracing the Magna Carta, young Henry's government could legitimize itself and steal the thunder from the French-backed rebels. In November 1216, just 1 month after John's death, a revised version of the Magna Carta was issued in Henry's name. This version removed some of the more radical clauses that had particularly angered John, but it kept the core principles that limited royal power and protected individual rights. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Many barons who had been fighting against the crown suddenly switched sides. After all, they weren't really rebels anymore. They were defenders of a charter that the king himself had endorsed. Prince Louis found his support evaporating, and by 1217, he was forced to abandon his invasion and return to France. And so, through one of history's great ironies, the Magna Carta survived not because of John's honor, but because of his treachery. His betrayal led to a war that ultimately killed him, and his death allowed wiser heads to prevail. The document that he tried so hard to destroy became the foundation stone of his son's reign. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. If John had simply honored the original agreement, the Magna Carta might have remained just another forgotten medieval treaty. Instead, his betrayal turned it into a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a rallying cry that would echo through the centuries. And there you have it. Did you know that the Magna Carta almost turned to dust because of John's betrayal? If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic power struggles, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with fellow history lovers, and drop a comment below. Which right from the Magna Carta do you think is most important today? Don't forget to subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible stories from the past that shaped our world. Here's where our story gets absolutely mind-blowing. That piece of parchment signed in a muddy field in 1215 didn't just stay in medieval England. It literally traveled across oceans and through centuries to spark revolutions around the world. Fast forward to 1776 and picture this scene. A group of colonial rebels are sitting in a stuffy room in Philadelphia, plotting against the British Empire. These men, we call them the Founding Fathers, are about to declare independence from King George III. But here's the fascinating part. As they're writing the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution, they keep referencing a document that's over 500 years old, the Magna Carta. John Adams, who would become America's second president, actually called the Magna Carta the Bible of the English Constitution. Thomas Jefferson had a copy in his personal library and studied it intensively. When they wrote about due process and trial by jury in the American Constitution, they were directly channeling principles that those rebellious English barons had fought for back in King John's time. But wait, it gets even more incredible. That famous phrase habeas corpus, you know, the legal principle that says you can't just throw someone in prison without charging them, that comes straight from the Magna Carta. Article 39 of the original charter stated that no free man could be imprisoned except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Sound familiar? That's basically the same thing we call habeas corpus today. The American revolutionaries weren't the only ones inspired by this ancient document. During the French Revolution in 1789, French revolutionaries looked to the Magna Carta as proof that even absolute monarchs could be forced to accept limits on their power. When they wrote their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, they were following a template that had been established centuries earlier in England. Here's a story that will blow your mind. In 1865, when Abraham Lincoln was fighting to preserve the Union during the Civil War, he suspended habeas corpus. His critics immediately pointed to the Magna Carta, arguing that Lincoln was violating principles that dated back 800 years. Even in the middle of America's bloodiest conflict, people were still invoking that medieval charter to defend individual rights. The influence spread even further. In 1948, when the United Nations was crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt and her committee explicitly referenced the Magna Carta as one of their foundational documents. Think about that. A document written to protect a handful of medieval English barons became the inspiration for universal human rights across the globe. Nelson Mandela, during his long fight against apartheid in South Africa, frequently cited the Magna Carta in his speeches and writings. He saw it as proof that the struggle for justice and equality wasn't new. It was part of a centuries-long human tradition of standing up to tyranny. But here's the ultimate irony that'll make your head spin. While the Magna Carta was inspiring revolutions and constitutions around the world, back in its home country of England, it was quietly being dismantled piece by piece. By the 1900s, almost every single clause of the original Magna Carta had been repealed or replaced by newer laws. Today, only 3 clauses from the original charter remain on English law books. 3 out of 63 original clauses. It's like watching a legendary rock band break up while their greatest hits album continues to top charts worldwide. One of the surviving clauses protects the liberties of the English Church. Another guarantees the ancient liberties of the City of London. And the third, this is the big one, states that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. That's the clause that gave birth to modern due process rights. So here's the beautiful paradox. In England, where the Magna Carta was born, it exists more as a symbol than as actual law. But everywhere else in the world, its principles are alive and kicking in constitutions, legal systems, and human rights declarations. The document has become something bigger than its original text. It's become an idea, the revolutionary concept that power must have limits, that rulers must answer to laws, and that individual rights are sacred. Every time a citizen challenges government overreach, every time a court protects someone's constitutional rights, every time people demand accountability from their leaders, they're channeling the spirit of those barons who stood up to King John 800 years ago. Here's a modern example that shows how relevant this still is. When Edward Snowden leaked classified documents about government surveillance in 2013, many of his supporters argued that the government's mass data collection violated principles that could be traced directly back to the Magna Carta. They weren't just talking about modern privacy rights, they were invoking 8 centuries of legal tradition about protecting individuals from government abuse. The Magna Carta's greatest achievement wasn't any specific law or right it established. Its greatest achievement was proving that change was possible. It showed that even the most powerful rulers could be forced to negotiate, that documents could limit tyranny, and that principles of justice could survive across centuries and continents. Today, when we talk about constitutional government, judicial review, or human rights, we're speaking a language that was first written in Latin on sheepskin parchment in 1215. The words may have changed, the technology is different, but the core idea remains the same. Power without limits is tyranny, and tyranny must always be resisted. That's the true legacy of the Magna Carta, not as a perfect document, but as proof that ordinary people can challenge extraordinary power and win. Let's bust some myths about the Magna Carta, because history isn't always what it seems. First off, forget what you might have heard about this being some kind of medieval declaration of democracy. The truth, it was more like an exclusive club membership for the wealthy and powerful. You see, while we celebrate the Magna Carta as a victory for human rights, it was really designed to protect the interests of wealthy barons. Picture this: You're a medieval peasant working the fields. The Magna Carta gets signed, there's all this excitement, but your life doesn't change one bit. You're still bound to your lord, still working the land, still living under the same harsh conditions. The document's protections, they applied to about 10% of England's population, the nobles, clergy and wealthy merchants. Everyone else, well, they were out of luck. Here's another misconception. Many people think the Magna Carta was the first document to ever limit royal power. Actually, Henry I had issued his Charter of Liberties more than 100 years earlier, in 1100, and across Europe, various kingdoms had their own versions of royal promises and limitations. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is why the Magna Carta became so famous. It wasn't about being first, it was about perfect timing and dramatic circumstances. Imagine a king, surrounded by angry barons with swords, being forced to put his royal seal on a document that basically said, "No, you can't do whatever you want." That was revolutionary. It wasn't just words on parchment. It was proof that even the most powerful person in the land could be forced to the negotiating table. And here's a fascinating detail many people don't know. The original Magna Carta was actually a failure. King John had no intention of honoring it, and the Pope annulled it within 10 weeks. But, and this is the clever part, when John died and his 9-year-old son Henry III took the throne, the document was reissued. Why? Because Henry's guardians knew they needed to make peace with the barons. They reissued it not once but 3 times, and each time its principles became more deeply rooted in English law. So while the Magna Carta wasn't exactly the democratic manifesto we sometimes imagine, its real significance lies in something far more profound. It established the revolutionary idea that even a king had to play by the rules. And that concept? Well, that changed everything. Think about it. From the American Constitution to modern human rights declarations, they all echo this fundamental principle that no one, no matter how powerful, should be above the law. Not bad for a document that started as a peace treaty between a bunch of wealthy barons and their troublesome king, right? As we reach the end of our journey through this remarkable chapter of history, let's reflect on something profound. Rights aren't gifts handed down from above. They're hard-won victories earned through struggle and determination. The Magna Carta teaches us this timeless lesson. Think about it. From that fateful day in 1215 at Runnymede to our modern world, this ancient piece of parchment represents an eternal struggle, the people standing up against the abuse of power. For over 800 years, its spirit has echoed through time, inspiring countless movements for justice and equality. You know what's fascinating? Every time you hear about checks and balances in government or when someone mentions the right to a fair trial, you're hearing the whispers of those rebellious barons who dared to challenge their king. The Magna Carta wasn't just a medieval document. It was a revolutionary idea that refuses to die. And here's something to keep you up at night. Imagine if tomorrow your leaders decided to ignore the law. What would you do? The barons of 1215 faced this exact question, and their answer changed the course of history. They didn't just complain or accept their fate, they took action. They showed us that when power goes unchecked, it's not just our right to speak up, it's our responsibility. Today, as we face our own challenges to democracy and human rights around the world, the Magna Carta remains a powerful reminder. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the power to create change lies in our hands, just as it did 8 centuries ago. But our journey through history doesn't end here. If you've enjoyed uncovering the dramatic story behind the Magna Carta, there's so much more to explore. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right. Share this video with your history-loving friends, because great stories deserve to be shared. And don't forget to subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more fascinating journeys through time. Join us next time as we continue to unravel the incredible tales that shaped our modern world. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and what we're capable of achieving when we stand together. See you in our next historical adventure.